She knocked 3 times, soft like she wasn't sure she should. I had been asleep for maybe an hour, which meant I was in that specific kind of tired where everything sounds wrong. Too sharp, too close. I almost convinced myself it was the building, old pipes, wind doing something against the hallway window. Then it came again. 3 knocks. The same soft 3. I opened the door and it was Renata, my ex-wife's younger sister, standing in the hallway at 2 in the morning in a coat she'd clearly thrown on over whatever she'd been sleeping in, her hair loose, her eyes doing something I couldn't read. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was checking that it was still me behind the door, and then she stepped very slightly forward, dropped her voice to almost nothing, and said it. "Don't make me go back to him." I didn't answer right away. I should say that plainly. I stood there in my own doorway, in the dark with Renata's voice still hanging in the air, and I didn't say a single word. Not because I didn't know what she meant, but because I knew exactly what she meant, and understanding something and knowing what to do with it are 2 entirely different things. She stayed in the doorway. She didn't push. She just waited. That was the moment everything I had been telling myself for 2 years stopped being true. My name is Daniel Ash. I'm 34. I work for a mid-sized logistics company doing route compliance analysis, which is a real job that I am occasionally asked to explain at parties, and which I cannot make interesting regardless of how much time I'm given. I live in the same building I moved into after the divorce. 4th floor. The unit with the window that sticks if the temperature drops below a certain point. I kept it because it was practical to keep it, and because finding somewhere new felt like a kind of optimism I hadn't earned yet. Elena and I had been married for 3 years. The divorce was not dramatic. That's the part people don't quite believe. They wait for me to say something sharp about it, something that explains it better than the truth does, which is that Elena and I ran out of whatever we'd had, slowly, and then, all at once, the way things do when neither person is willing to say out loud that the warmth is gone, we agreed on almost everything in the end. We divided things evenly. We were polite in a way that felt like grief with all the noise taken out. I've spoken to her twice since. Both times were civil. Both times were exactly as sad as you'd expect. Renata I knew before I knew Elena well. She was the one who had been sitting at the kitchen table the first time Elena brought me home, 3 years older than I expected a younger sister to seem. Reading a book with a cracked spine and drinking tea from a mug that had a small cartoon bear on it and looked like something she'd kept since she was 12. She looked up when we came in, looked at me with the particular kind of assessment that younger sisters do, and said, "Nice coat. It doesn't match the bag, though." Elena had groaned. Renata had gone back to her book. I had liked her immediately. The thing about Renata was that she was always the sharper one. Not unkind, sharp. She noticed things before you'd finished doing them. She asked the question that came one step ahead of the question you were ready for. She made friends easily and kept them quietly and didn't seem to need anyone's approval, in a way that I always thought was the most underrated kind of confidence. The prop she carried everywhere was a notebook, the same battered olive green one for years, or a series of identical ones I could never tell apart. She wrote in it constantly. "Not journaling," she said once, when I asked. "Just thinking. There is a difference." I never asked what the difference was. I should have. She started dating Corey around the same time Elena and I started struggling, which I noticed only because Renata was suddenly quieter at the few family dinners I still attended that year. Not sad, quieter, like she was rationing words for something she hadn't decided on yet. Corey came to one of those dinners. He was handsome in a deliberate way and talked about himself with the specific, exhausting fluency of a man who had never been told to stop. I sat across from Renata for 2 hours and watched her eat without saying much. She caught me looking once and gave me a very small private smile that meant something I didn't let myself name at the time. The divorce happened. I moved out. Renata texted me 4 days later. "I heard." That was brave. Just that. I didn't know what to say back, so I said, "Thank you." She said, "You're allowed to be sad." I said, "I know." She said, "Good," and then didn't text again for 3 weeks. And I thought about that exchange more than was reasonable. The inciting incident, if I'm being precise about where things cracked open, was a Sunday in March. Renata had texted me that afternoon. Not with anything heavy. She just wanted to know if the deli on Ferris Street still had the lentil soup she liked. because she was in the neighborhood and couldn't remember if it was that one or the place 2 blocks over. I told her it was the one on Ferris. She texted back a thank you and then 20 minutes later knocked on my door, standing there with 2 paper cups of soup and her olive notebook tucked under one arm, and said, "I was already down here. You don't have to let me in." I let her in. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. The building was quiet. It was one of those Sunday afternoons that has a particular quality of light, low and pale and directionless. That makes time feel slow in a way that's either comfortable or unbearable, depending on who you're with. With Renata, it was comfortable. We talked about nothing that mattered, and a few things that did. She told me Corey had been moody lately. She said it the way people say things they've been saying to themselves for a while, and finally say out loud just to hear how it sounds. I didn't ask follow-up questions. She didn't offer more. At some point, her fingers went still around her paper cup, and she looked at the table, and she said quietly, "I think I stay because I can't picture what leaving looks like." I said, "That changes. The picture gets clearer." She looked up at me. She held my gaze for 1 second longer than felt safe. Then she looked away. I blamed the lentil soup for how that afternoon made me feel. I blamed the particular quality of Sunday light. I blamed the divorce and the general vulnerability of men who eat takeout alone on weekends. None of that was accurate. All of it was convenient. The next time I saw her was at her mother's birthday dinner 6 weeks later. Corey was there. He spent most of the evening talking over her. Not aggressively, just with the casual thoughtlessness of someone who doesn't notice the spaces between other people's words. I watched Renata set her fork down too gently at one point when he interrupted her mid-sentence, and then pick it up again and take a careful bite of something, and I thought, she is managing him. She has been managing him for so long, she does it without deciding to. After dinner, I went to get my jacket from the hall closet, and she was already there, standing with her coat half on, staring at something outside the narrow window above the coat rack. I said something forgettable, something about the drive, about the weather, and she turned and looked at me in a way that wasn't about the weather. She said, "Do you ever miss it, being married?" I said, "I miss having someone to talk to at the end of the day." She said, "Yeah, just that." And then she finished putting her coat on and went back inside. I drove home thinking about the word "yeah," about everything she'd put into it by not putting anything else in. The next week, her sister, Elena of all people, called me. We'd had almost no contact since the divorce, so her name appearing on my phone had the quality of something wrong. But she wasn't calling about anything urgent. She was calling because she'd had lunch with Renata and was worried. She said, "She doesn't look like herself. She's too careful with everything she says." I said I'd noticed. Elena was quiet for a moment, and then said in the particular voice of a woman saying something she has decided to say, even if it lands badly, "She's always trusted you, more than she trusted most people." I said I knew. She said, "Okay, that's all I needed to say." She hung up. I have poor survival instincts around the women in that family. I didn't see Renata for another 3 weeks. Then it was 2 in the morning and she was at my door. She came in without much ceremony. She sat down on the couch and pulled her coat tighter around herself, even though the apartment was warm. And for a while she didn't say anything. I made tea. I didn't ask questions. The olive notebook was in her bag. I could see the spine of it poking out of the half-open zip. And she kept touching the bag strap with 2 fingers, not holding it, just touching it, like she was checking it was still there. Finally, she said, "He's not. He doesn't hit me. I want to say that first." I said, "Okay." She said, "But he talks to me like I'm..." And then she stopped. She pressed her lips together. She tried again. "He talks to me like I don't know anything, like everything I think is either wrong or irrelevant. And I've been telling myself for a year that I'm overreacting, that I'm being sensitive, that relationships go through this and you push through it." She looked at her hands, and then tonight he said something. It wasn't even the worst thing he said. It wasn't dramatic. It was just this one sentence. And I sat in the kitchen after he went to bed and I thought, I don't want to be here. I said, "What did he say?" She shook her head slightly. "It doesn't matter what it was. What matters is that I sat there and the only person I could think of, the only place that felt like somewhere I could breathe, was here." She looked up at me then, steady, a little frightened of what she'd just said, but not taking it back. I shouldn't have come. It's late. You barely. We're not even. I said, you can stay. She went still. Not dramatically, just still. I said, the couch pulls out. I have extra pillows. You don't have to decide anything tonight except that you're not driving back there at 2 in the morning. She looked at me for a long time. Her fingers weren't on the bag strap anymore. They were in her lap, pressed together, and I could see she was deciding something. Not about the couch, not about the logistics of it, about whether this was a place that was safe enough to admit what she was actually doing here. She said quietly, my name is in your phone as Ren. I said, I know. She said, I checked once. When you set it up after you got the new phone, I looked to see what you'd put. She looked away. That was 18 months ago. I was with Corey. I told myself it was just that I was just curious. A pause. I changed Corey's name 3 weeks ago to something generic, and yours is still Ren. That sentence did something quiet to the room. I said, you don't have to say more than that. She said, I know. I said, and if you want to stop here, take the couch, wake up tomorrow, and go figure out your life. And we never talk about this again. That's okay, I mean it. You can have the exit. She looked at me then, really looked at me, the way she had in the hall at her mother's birthday dinner, the way she had at the kitchen table in March. She said, I have been trying to stop thinking about you since that afternoon with the soup. Her voice was very quiet. Every time I tried, I'd think, it's just because the relationship is bad. It's just because he's safe to think about. And then I'd be in a room with you and it wouldn't feel theoretical. Something in my chest shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. I said, when something good happened this year, something that only I would care about, the first person I wanted to tell was you. And when things were bad, same answer. I paused. That kept being true no matter what I did with it. She breathed out slowly. She nodded. Once. I reached across and took her hand. Not quickly, just put my hand over hers where it rested on her knee and let her decide what to do with that. She turned her hand over and held mine. We stayed like that for a moment. Just that, nothing more. And then her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her, and she looked at it, and it was a text from her mother, who had apparently been awake at 2 in the morning for reasons entirely her own and wanted to know if Renata had seen the photo she'd sent of the cat. Renata laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. She texted back something quick, set the phone face down, looked at me and said, my mother's cat is apparently sitting in a pasta bowl. I said that sounded accurate. She laughed again, and then she rested her head against the back of the couch and closed her eyes, and she looked, for the first time since she'd knocked on my door, like a woman who had put something down. 3 months later, the olive notebook had a small water stain on the corner from when I'd knocked a glass off the counter, and it was sitting too close. She showed it to me like evidence of something. I said I'd buy her a new one. She said she didn't want a new one, she wanted the same one, and then she put it back on the kitchen counter in exactly the same spot, which was how I understood that the apartment had become something shared without either of us making a formal decision about it. A year after that, her sister called me again. Not worried this time. She said, I haven't heard her laugh like that in 3 years. I didn't say anything. She said, I know, and hung up. 2 years later, when people ask how it started, Renata tells it differently than I do. She says it started the afternoon she came over with the soup, and I didn't ask any follow-up questions because she'd been with someone who had an answer for everything, and the not asking felt like the safest thing in the world. I say it started at the door at 2 in the morning when she asked me for something and I gave her what she actually needed, which was simply the choice to stay or go. We are both right. It had probably been building long before either version. It felt late when we finally named it, late in the best possible way. What would you have done if someone you cared about showed up at your door at 2 in the morning and asked you not to send them back? And have you ever stayed somewhere too long? A job? A relationship? A version of yourself? Because you couldn't picture what leaving looked like. Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.